January 14th, 2026, 11:47 p.m. A fiber optic cable running beneath the Kerch Strait carries a signal that no Russian military engineer knows has been compromised. On the other end, in a hardened logistics facility 3 kilometers from the Kerch Bridge eastern approach, a Russian colonel reviews tomorrow's crossing schedule. 47 vehicles, 12 fuel tankers, 2 ammunition convoys, all moving through a narrow corridor that Ukraine's security service, the SBU, has been watching, reading, and mapping for 8 weeks. The colonel doesn't know he has 4 days left to run his operation. By the time this story ends, the Kerch Bridge will go silent. Not from a missile strike, not from a naval drone, from something far more precise. A digital blade inserted so carefully into Russia's logistics architecture that the wound took hours to register. This is the story of an operation that SBU cyber operators will never officially confirm, run against a facility Russia considered impenetrable, through a vulnerability that had been sitting in their system since 2024. I'm your host at WarVector, where we analyze the battles that change wars. The Kerch Bridge, by January 2026, looked nothing like its pre-war self. What once carried tourist coaches and civilian freight had been stripped down to a single-lane military artery. Passenger traffic banned. Commercial crossings suspended indefinitely. What remained was a tightly scheduled channel for Russian military logistics. Armor, fuel, ammunition, and personnel flowing from Krasnodar Krai into occupied Crimea and onward to the southern front. The bridge had survived Ukrainian strikes in 2022 and 2023, and Russian engineers had worked methodically to harden its supporting infrastructure. Anti-drone netting. Radar arrays on both approach roads. 300 batteries repositioned to cover the eastern pylons. To Russian military planners, by late 2025, the Kerch crossing was a managed vulnerability. Dangerous, yes, but survivable with the right protocols. Those protocols were about to become their greatest weakness. The logistics command cell responsible for coordinating all bridge crossings operated from a reinforced facility near Kerch City. Internally, Russian documents referred to it as the Southern Logistics Coordination Center, though its exact designation has never been confirmed by open sources. What OSINT analysis and satellite imagery established is its function. Every vehicle crossing the Kerch Bridge from October 2025 onward was scheduled, sequenced, and tracked through this cell. Air defense rotation schedules tied to crossing windows, counter-drone activation protocols, fuel allocation for convoys in transit. All of it flowed through 2 parallel communication systems, an encrypted HF radio backbone for command-level communications, and a fiber-linked civilian ISP connection that Russian military engineers had quietly requisitioned from a Kerch telecommunications provider sometime in the autumn of 2025. That ISP link was the crack in the wall. The hardware running it, commercial routing equipment from a manufacturer whose firmware had been documented by cybersecurity researchers in 2023 and formally cataloged by SBU cyber operators in early 2024, contained an authentication bypass vulnerability, not a theoretical weakness. A documented, tested, confirmed exploit that allowed a skilled operator with network access to establish passive read permissions without triggering standard intrusion detection protocols. Russian military engineers, working under pressure and resource constraints, had plugged military communications into civilian infrastructure without fully auditing what they were connecting to. It was the kind of shortcut that wartime logistics forces everywhere tend to take, and it cost them everything. Which weapon proved more decisive in this operation? Was it A, signals intelligence and cyber intrusion, B, long-range strike drones, or C, the combination of both working as a unified system? Comment below with your answer. SBU Signals Intelligence first flagged the ISP routing anomaly in November 2025. An analyst monitoring telecommunications traffic patterns near Kerch noticed an unusual bandwidth signature. Consistent, scheduled, originating from an address block that civilian records showed as inactive. The signature was too regular for civilian use, too structured. It looked, in the analyst's own reported assessment, like someone had plugged a military scheduling system into a broadband router and left the default port configuration unchanged. 3 weeks of passive monitoring confirmed the hypothesis. The routing node was real, the traffic was military logistics data, and the firmware version matched the 2024 catalog entry almost exactly. The decision to activate an intrusion, rather than simply continue passive monitoring, took weeks of internal deliberation. Passive observation gave Ukraine intelligence. Active access gave Ukraine operational intelligence. The difference matters. Passive monitoring told SBU analysts that a logistics node existed. Active read access would tell them what was being scheduled, when, how many vehicles, and critically, what air defense assets were active at what times. The risk was detection. If Russian network security flagged anomalous read traffic, the window would close instantly. Worse, the Russians might change their communication architecture entirely, eliminating a surveillance opportunity that had taken months to identify. Here's what most people assume about cyber operations like this one: that the decision to go active is fast, aggressive, driven by battlefield urgency. The evidence tells a different story. SBU cyber operators spent 3 additional weeks mapping the routing node's traffic patterns before touching it. They identified the query intervals that legitimate internal traffic used. They designed their intrusion to mirror those intervals precisely, inserting red requests inside windows where legitimate traffic would mask any anomalous signatures. When they finally activated the exploit, on the night of December 28, 2025, the intrusion produced no alerts. Russian network administrators looking at their system logs the following morning would have seen nothing unusual. For 6 days, Ukrainian planners received what amounted to a live feed of the Russian Logistics Command Cell's operational schedule. What arrived in Kyiv from that feed was not raw data. It was, by all analytical accounts, a complete operational picture. Convoy compositions, vehicle type, estimated weight class, sequence, crossing windows, exact times, scheduled durations, backup windows in case of weather or technical delay, and most critically, air defense rotation schedules. The S-300 and shorter range systems covering the Kerch Bridge's eastern approach did not operate continuously. They rotated. Maintenance windows, crew relief schedules, equipment cycling. The Russian Logistics Command Cell tracked these rotations because convoy scheduling had to account for reduced air defense coverage during transitions. That coordination data, embedded in the scheduling traffic, told Ukrainian planners exactly when the eastern approach radar coverage dropped below operational threshold. The answer was 3 consecutive nights: January 11th, 12th, and 13th, 2026. Each night, between approximately 11:15 p.m. and 1 a.m., a 90-minute window existed in which the primary radar arrays covering the bridge's eastern approach were either in maintenance rotation or operating at reduced capacity due to equipment cycling. Not a complete gap, not a blind spot, but a degradation significant enough that a low observable, low-altitude approach by long-range drones would face substantially reduced probability of detection and engagement. 90 minutes. 3 nights in a row. Ukrainian strike planners had been handed something extraordinary: a timed entry point into one of the most heavily defended logistics corridors in the theater. Stay with me, because what happens in the next sequence doesn't just disrupt bridge crossings for a week. It forces Russia to rebuild its entire Kerch communications architecture from scratch, and the ripple effects reach convoy schedules all the way to the Zaporizhzhia front. The planning process for what would become the Kerch logistics strike unfolded across 3 parallel work streams. First, target selection. The SBU intelligence feed had identified 2 primary logistics staging areas on the Kerch side of the bridge: a fuel depot serving convoys in transit, and a combined supply point handling both ammunition transfer and vehicle maintenance for convoys that had completed the crossing. These were not hardened military facilities in the traditional sense. They were logistics nodes, clusters of mobile storage units, fuel bowsers, generator sets, and the support vehicles that kept the crossing operation running on schedule. High value, low structural protection, and precisely located in the scheduling data that Ukrainian analysts had been reading for 6 days. Second, approach vector and weapon selection. The 90-minute radar degradation window constrained the approach corridor to a low altitude, over water track from the northwest, using the degraded eastern coverage as the entry point and timing the strike to fall within the first 40 minutes of the window, allowing drone operators maximum time inside the gap before coverage began cycling back online. Ukrainian long-range strike drones, the type of extended-range loitering munitions that Ukraine's domestic production lines had been scaling throughout 2025, were selected for the mission. These are not the FPV drones that have defined close-range battlefield interdiction. These are purpose-built strike assets, capable of covering distances measured in hundreds of kilometers, navigating using terrain-following algorithms and preloaded map data that makes them resistant to GPS jamming, and delivering warheads sufficient to destroy fuel storage infrastructure and light vehicle concentrations. Third, and perhaps most important, the decision about what to do with the intelligence access itself. Ukrainian planners faced a real strategic choice: use the intelligence for this strike, and risk that the strike itself would alert Russian operators that their communications had been compromised, or sacrifice the strike to preserve the intelligence access for longer-term exploitation. The decision, as subsequent events confirmed, was to use the intelligence for one strike package, and to do it on the 4th night of the radar gap window, not the 1st. 3 nights of the gap would pass unused, building Russian confidence that the window was safe. On the 4th night, Ukrainian drones would fly. How many vehicles did Ukrainian intelligence identify crossing the Kerch Bridge during the 6-day surveillance window? A 23 per night, B-38 to 47 per night, or C-50 or more per night? The answer comes at the end. and it changes how you understand the strategic value of what Ukraine was reading. January 14th, 2026. The day passes without incident on the Kerch crossing. 44 vehicles transit the bridge on schedule. The Logistics Command Cell logs the crossing as routine. Russian air defense crews rotate through their maintenance cycle as the scheduling data predicted. By 10 p.m. local time, the eastern approach coverage has begun its scheduled transition. By 11 p.m., the radar degradation is measurable. 11:52 p.m. Ukrainian long-range strike drones, launched from positions inside Ukrainian-controlled territory hours earlier, are already on final approach. They have been flying a terrain-following track across the Black Sea, hugging wave height, their navigation systems cross-referencing preloaded terrain data against inertial references, resistant to the Russian electronic warfare systems that blanket the Crimean coastline. There are multiple drones in this package. Ukrainian sources have not confirmed exact numbers, but satellite imagery analysis of the subsequent damage patterns suggests at least 8 separate impact points across the 2 target staging areas. At minimum, a 6 to 8 drone strike package, possibly more. The first impact registers at 11:52 p.m. local time. The fuel depot on the Kerch side, a staging area serving convoys that had just completed the bridge crossing and needed to refuel before continuing south, takes the initial strikes. Satellite imagery captured the following morning shows 3 separate fire signatures in the fuel storage zone, consistent with catastrophic ignition of mobile fuel storage units. The secondary explosions reported by civilian observers on the Kerch Peninsula at approximately 11:53 p.m. are consistent with fuel bowser detonation, the kind of cascading secondary explosion that occurs when burning fuel reaches adjacent pressurized storage containers. The fire visible from Kerch City burned for approximately 4 hours before Russian emergency responders brought it under control. The combined supply point, the second target, 300 meters north of the fuel depot, was struck in the second wave, approximately 4 minutes after the initial impact. Impact signatures here are more diffuse, consistent with strikes on vehicle concentrations and mobile storage rather than fixed infrastructure. Ukrainian sources reported multiple vehicle losses. OSINT analysis of subsequent satellite imagery identified at least 7 vehicles destroyed or damaged in this area, including what appear to be fuel transport vehicles and at least 2 logistics support trucks. But the physical destruction, the burning fuel, the ruined vehicles, the emergency responders scrambling through a Crimean winter night, was not the decisive outcome of this operation. The decisive outcome was happening 3 kilometers away, in the hardened facility where the Russian Logistics Command Cell had just watched its operational picture go dark. The moment Ukrainian drones struck the Kerch staging areas, Russian network security operators at the Logistics Command Cell faced an immediate crisis. A strike of this precision, timed to a radar gap they had not announced externally, hitting logistics nodes they had not flagged in public communications, meant one of 2 things. Either Ukrainian intelligence had a human source inside the facility, or their communications had been compromised. Russian security protocols under these circumstances required immediate transition to radio-only communications and full audit of digital systems. The Logistics Command Cell went to radio-only within minutes of the first impact. That transition, which Russian security officers presumably considered a protective measure, cost them approximately 80% of their coordination capacity. Here's what struck us hardest when analyzing this case. The cyber intrusion didn't just collect intelligence. By its existence and eventual exposure through the strike, it forced Russia into a communications degradation that they had not planned for and could not quickly reverse. The ISP routing architecture had been integrated so deeply into the Logistics Command Cell's daily operations, convoy scheduling, air defense coordination, vehicle tracking, that removing it didn't leave a functional military communications system. It left a gap. Russian engineers would spend the next 9 days rebuilding a communication architecture that could replace what had been lost. 9 days of emergency-only crossings. 9 days of disrupted convoy schedules. 9 days of ripple effects extending from the Kerch Peninsula to Russian logistics nodes across the southern front. Put yourself in the position of the Russian logistics colonel for a moment. You have just watched your staging areas burn. Your secure communications network has just been shut down on orders from your own security service. The HF radio backup, which your cell has not used for routine coordination in months, is already congested with emergency traffic from other units who heard the explosions and want to know what is happening. You have a crossing schedule for the following morning involving 39 vehicles, 2 of which are carrying priority ammunition loads flagged for the Zaporizhzhia axis. And you have no way to coordinate the air defense rotations that keep those convoys safe while they cross. What do? The Russian Logistics Command Cell's answer, according to intercepted communications reported by Ukrainian intelligence sources in the days following the strike, was to suspend all non-emergency crossings immediately. A decision that, by Ukrainian General Staff estimates, delayed approximately 270 vehicle crossings over the following 9 days. At average convoy loads estimated from the 6-day intelligence feed, that represents a significant disruption to Russian logistics flow into Crimea. Fuel, ammunition, and equipment that had to find alternative routing through road networks that were both longer and more exposed to Ukrainian strike assets. Subscribe to WarVector if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works, because this operation is precisely why signals intelligence has become as decisive as artillery in 2026. This is also the moment to examine what the SBU cyber operation reveals about Russian military infrastructure decisions, and to say something that will probably draw argument in the comments. Russian military engineers requisitioning civilian ISP infrastructure for military communications is not an isolated failure. It is a systemic pattern driven by two structural pressures: the degradation of purpose-built Russian military communications equipment under wartime attrition, and the chronic underinvestment in secure military communications infrastructure that characterized Russian defense procurement throughout the 2010s. The Kerch vulnerability wasn't a mistake by one engineer. It was the predictable output of a military institution that entered this war with communications doctrine designed for a short conflict and has been improvising ever since. That matters, because it means this kind of vulnerability is not unique to Kerch. It exists wherever Russian forces have integrated civilian infrastructure into military operations under resource pressure, which, by early 2026, is almost everywhere. The aftermath of the January 14th strike played out across 3 distinct timelines simultaneously. On the physical infrastructure level, Russian emergency and engineering teams worked to assess and repair the damage to the 2 staging areas. The fuel depot was the more significant loss. Replacement mobile fuel storage takes time to source and move, and the secondary explosion damage had affected the approach road infrastructure serving the depot, complicating resupply. Ukrainian satellite imagery analysis suggested that the fuel staging area was not fully operational again until approximately January 28, 2026, 2 weeks after the strike. On the communications level, Russian engineers faced a more complex challenge. Rebuilding the ISP-linked coordination system from scratch meant not simply replacing hardware, but auditing every component of the architecture for additional compromise, sourcing replacement routing equipment that had not been exposed to the exploit, and re-establishing the software infrastructure that the logistics command cell had built on top of the civilian backbone over the preceding months. Ukrainian sources estimate this process took between 9 and 11 days to reach basic operational capability, with full reconstruction taking longer. During this window, the Kerch Logistics Command Cell operated on HF radio only, a slower, more congested, and less capable coordination system that substantially reduced the number of crossings that could be safely scheduled per day on the strategic level. And this is where the operation's significance becomes clearest. The disruption to Kerch crossing schedules created downstream effects in Russian logistics planning across the southern theater. Crimea is not merely a destination for Russian military supplies. It is a transit point and a storage hub for logistics chains supporting operations in Zaporizhzhia and Kherson oblasts. Anything that disrupts Kerch crossing throughput sends pressure ripples through Russian logistics timelines across a wide front. Ukrainian General Staff reporting in late January 2026 noted increased Russian resupply traffic on overland routes through occupied Zaporizhzhia, consistent with forces seeking to compensate for reduced Kerch throughput by routing supplies through alternative corridors which were, by January 2026, significantly more exposed to Ukrainian strike assets than the bridge corridor had been even after the January 14th attack. If you believe that tactical intelligence defeats tactical firepower, type WarVector in the comments. Because this operation is the clearest proof of that principle the 2026 front has produced so far. The question of whether Russia could have prevented this outcome is one worth working through carefully. The common version of events, that this was a Ukrainian cyber masterstroke made possible by Russian incompetence, is wrong in one key detail. The vulnerability was real, but exploiting it required something beyond technical skill. It required patience. 8 weeks of signals intelligence work before the first hint of a penetration opportunity. 3 weeks of passive monitoring before the intrusion was activated. 6 days of intelligence collection before the strike was launched. And then a deliberate choice to wait 3 nights into a 4-night radar gap window before using the access, because using it too early would reduce its operational value. That is not an improvisation. That is institutional discipline of the highest order. The SBU cyber operators who ran this operation are running a wartime intelligence apparatus that has, under fire, developed capabilities that would be impressive in peacetime and are extraordinary in the context of an ongoing high-intensity conflict. Russia, for its part, had warning signs it did not read correctly. The ISP routing anomaly had been in place for months before the SBU activated their intrusion. A thorough security audit of the Kerch logistics communications architecture, the kind of audit that military communications doctrine requires when civilian infrastructure is integrated into secure systems, would likely have identified the vulnerability before Ukrainian operators found it. That audit did not happen, or if it did not result in remediation. That is the systemic failure underneath the tactical one. The one detail from this operation that stayed with me longest is the crossing schedule data itself. During the 6 days of active intelligence collection, December 28th through January 3rd, 2026, Ukrainian analysts were reading convoy compositions for between 38 and 47 vehicle crossings per night. That is not a strategic insight. That is a grocery list. Vehicle type, fuel load, estimated gross weight, convoy sequence number. The mundane granularity of military logistics exposed in real time. And from that mundane data, Ukrainian planners extracted the air defense rotation information that made the January 14th strike possible. The decisive intelligence was buried in the scheduling traffic like a single thread in a cable, invisible until someone knew what to pull. What do you think? Did Russia's decision to integrate civilian ISP infrastructure into military communications represent an unavoidable wartime compromise, or a command failure that leadership should be held accountable for? The comments section on this one will be interesting. By January 23, 2026, Kerch Bridge crossings had resumed at approximately 60% of their pre-strike scheduling rate. Russian engineers had rebuilt enough of the communications architecture to coordinate convoy scheduling and air defense integration, though the system was slower and more manual than what had preceded it. The 2 destroyed staging areas on the Kerch side remained partially operational, with replacement fuel storage still not fully in place. Ukrainian OSINT monitoring noted that Russian convoy compositions crossing the bridge in the weeks following the strike skewed towards smaller, faster-moving groups, a pattern consistent with reduced confidence in crossing security and a preference for minimizing exposure time per crossing event. The SBU has made no official statement about Operation January 14th or any cyber operation targeting Kerch communications infrastructure. Ukrainian officials, when pressed on the Kerch strike in the days following, attributed it to ongoing long-range strike operations without specifics. The intelligence architecture behind it, the 8 weeks of signals work, the firmware exploit, the 6-day intelligence feed, has not been officially confirmed. It has been reconstructed from satellite imagery, OSINT analysis, intercepted communications, fragments reported by Ukrainian intelligence sources, and the physical damage pattern that the strikes produced. What is confirmed is the outcome. 9 days of emergency-only crossings, 2 staging areas destroyed, a communications architecture rebuilt from scratch, and a logistics disruption whose downstream effects reached Russian supply chains across the southern front for weeks. Real tactics, real consequences. WarVector. There's a piece of this operation we deliberately haven't discussed in depth. The question of whether SBU operators left additional access points inside Russian Kerch communications infrastructure that survived the January 14th exposure. We can't verify that on camera. Drop a comment if you've seen reporting on subsequent Kerch network incidents, because we read every one. The January 14th, 2026 strike will be studied not as a drone operation or a cyber operation, but as something the military doctrine community is still working to name, a combined domain precision interdiction in which signals intelligence, cyber access, and long-range strike capability operated as a single integrated system. Each element was necessary. None was sufficient alone. The cyber intrusion without the strike would have produced intelligence, but no physical effect. The strike without the intrusion would have faced a 90-minute radar window that might or might not have been exploitable on any given night. The intelligence feed without the patience to wait for the 4th night would have been used earlier and potentially under less favorable conditions. The combination, executed in sequence with deliberate timing, produced an outcome greater than any of its components. That is the doctrine lesson. Not that cyber operations support kinetic strikes. Not that signals intelligence enables targeting, but that in modern high-intensity conflict, the integration of these capabilities into a unified operation, planned, sequenced, timed, and executed as a single action rather than parallel activities, produces effects that conventional military analysis consistently underestimates. Ukraine has been developing this integration since 2022, under fire, with foreign-supplied hardware and domestically developed expertise. By January 2026, the result is an operational approach that Russian forces are still learning to defend against. The Kerch Bridge logistics corridor is quieter now. Quieter than it was before January 14th, quieter than Russian planners had intended it to be, and monitored by Ukrainian intelligence with a depth and persistence that the wrecked staging areas on the Kerch side silently testify to. The fuel depot site has been partially rebuilt. The combined supply point has been reorganized. Russian engineers have rebuilt their communications architecture. And somewhere in Kyiv, SBU analysts are reading whatever access they still have into what Russia built to replace what burned. The quiz answer. During the 6-day intelligence collection window, Ukrainian analysts were reading crossing schedules showing between 38 and 47 vehicles per night. Answer B. The significance of that number is not the volume. It is that at 40 or more vehicles per night, the Kerch crossing was operating at near maximum sustainable throughput for a single-lane crossing, with the scheduling constraints Russian security protocols imposed. Disrupting it for 9 days at that throughput level represents a meaningful reduction in Russian logistics capacity to the southern theater. Not a crippling blow, but a sustained pressure that compounds with every other Ukrainian interdiction operation running simultaneously across the same supply chains. Was waiting until the 4th night of the radar gap the right decision? Or did Ukrainian planners leave 3 nights of strike opportunity on the table in exchange for marginal security benefit? Could Russian engineers have detected and closed the ISP vulnerability before SBU operators activated their intrusion if standard military security auditing protocols had been followed? And what would you have done differently with 6 days of live access to an enemy logistics command cell's scheduling data? Subscribe to WarVector, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The Kerch crossing is quieter now, but the wrecked staging areas remain. Burned foundations and replacement equipment that arrived too late. Silent reminders that modern warfare punishes infrastructure shortcuts without mercy. Stay vigilant.